Hello, I'm Seth Simmons, and welcome to Season 1, Episode 3 of Opt Out. Opt Out is a show where I sit down with passionate people to learn why privacy matters to them, the tools and techniques they found and leveraged, and where we encourage and inspire others towards personal privacy and data sovereignty. Have you been wanting to learn more about mobile privacy but not sure where to start? This episode, we're going to sit down with Max Tannahill to chat about mobile OSs for those seeking privacy, and Calyx OS in particular. Welcome on the show, Max.
Thank you very much for having me, Seth.
Yeah, man, it's good to finally sit down and chat. How's your week been going so far?
All good. Yeah. I think, like all of us, we're pretty busy at the moment. We've all got kind of day jobs that take our time and various other drama in the evenings and mornings, whatever, with stuff happening online. Obviously, the world's a little different, but no, I can't complain. It's overall a good place to be where I am.
Awesome. Well, why don't you just go ahead and jump in, tell us a little bit about who you are, what you do, and we'll get rolling.
Yeah, sure. I've been. I'm obviously from the UK. I'm currently living in Singapore. Have been for about the last kind of over 10 years now, and I work primarily like financial services. So that's kind of where I've been, where I've kind of cut my teeth as a career. Very kind of varied time in there. Generally kind of work on kind of systems implementation, so kind of trade and order execution. That's kind of I suppose my bread and butter now. So it sometimes surprises some people, given certainly in this space we tend to talk amongst kind of privacy and certainly kind of on the cryptocurrency space, which is where I kind of obviously have come across you, Seth, and a lot of our mutual acquaintances and friends. But then kind of about a year ago, which was a kind of culmination of a number of things, I set up Mamushi Mobile, which is a website for retailing secure phones, essentially. And our primary partner at that time was Copperhead, who had been releasing for a while software specifically designed for Pixel phones. So yeah, the business was set up to essentially help them get those devices into the hands of ordinary individuals such as you and myself, and really bring those kind of devices to people that may not have already been able to get hold of them through kind of customizing their own device, in a way that was probably a little less approachable for some people, that are not used to, say, technically loading onto a new operating system of their phone, or potentially can't even get hold of that operating system to put onto the phone. And really, that I suppose came about from kind of many years in the cryptocurrency space, both as an investor and hobbyist, and it kind of from that experience, I'd seen the need for that kind of that operating system and that service, so yeah, set that up a year ago, and quite a lot has happened since.
Awesome. Well, so you basically have two full-time jobs, working in Mamushi and then working in the regular world.
Yeah, it's been. I suppose it's been easier, actually, funnily enough, since the pandemic. Normally in Singapore, it's very common for people to travel extensively. It's only just a small city-state. So when life shuts down and you can't travel as easily, you do tend to need to find other hobbies, and that's actually fundamentally one of the reasons why I started it. We've been going through a bit of a lockdown here, and I kind of had extra time, couldn't go to the gym as easily, so it was kind of something to keep myself focused with at the time, and have something to do. And when you've got kind of a few hours concentrated on the weekend, and you haven't got all the distractions of a gym, swimming pool, a social life, on that plus side, it's amazing what you can get done.
Yeah, I definitely understand. I feel like a lot of people started up side projects or side businesses or something like that during this extra time that we have.
Or learning a musical instrument or something like that. Quite a few of those things.
Everyone needed something, so. Yeah, I'm curious. I mean, if you don't mind mentioning, what was it that drew you to Singapore? I've been there for work in the past and love the city, but curious what drew you there from the UK.
Oh, so funnily enough, actually, it was very much something that I think it was actually not. It was just really the just the needs of the job at the time. My boss, when I was the first company I've been working at, was actually based in the US. I fully expected to be living and working in the US. I think as a young guy at that time, without any personal commitments, I was very happy to travel, kind of see the world, and I was, felt a little constrained in having, just being stuck still in the same country I've grown up in. I think, if you've kind of got a bit of a travel bug, you enjoy going somewhere else. But really, it just turned out that there was kind of space in Singapore at the time. They needed someone to do some particular projects. I got sent out as a young guy, and at that point, I hadn't even been to Asia, and I'd already kind of agreed to kind of leave and work out there. So it just kind of happened from there, really. And since then, I've just stayed there. Obviously, once you're in a new place and you then start putting roots down, you end up suddenly realizing 10 years has passed. So it's very much, it wasn't planned.
Nice. And was it something with that job or with cryptocurrency that woke you up to the need for personal privacy, or just something totally unrelated?
So I wouldn't say it's unrelated, but I would say the whole kind of personal privacy and cryptocurrency thing kind of came about around the same time. And I actually, funnily enough, I can't even really pinpoint when it happened. There's a few little things, I suppose, that jump out at me. I think to put it best, taking kind of a bit of a step back, probably around 2010, for example. I mean, I'd never been a particularly a technical person. I hadn't been interested in. I'd be very normie, as it would be discussed. I would have had like Windows on my machine prior to 2010 or 11, and I wouldn't have really cared particularly about security in devices or privacy as such. But I think a few things change is that once I moved abroad, I was kind of a fairly early adopter of stuff like Telegram and WhatsApp, just primarily for keeping in touch with family and friends. And so you find yourself, just because of the situation you're in, using that kind of tech because you need to, because you haven't got the convenience of just being close by to pop around and see someone that near you because they're in close physical proximity. So I was using kind of video calling and all that. And stuff over VoIP, all that kind of earlier than some of my friends. But then I think a few things have kind of happened. Is that I think at the time, I think Snowden allegations Snowden revelations rather had been coming out, and I think for someone like me, who even with the background that I had, I think it was a bit of it fundamentally changed who I put trust in. And regardless of your opinions on Snowden, and I suppose even back then I would have considered myself kind of relatively patriotic, probably kind of conservative, with a small c, and right wing. It was hard not to have your faith shaken in some of the institutions that we'd allowed. I think I believe probably back then it was completely fine for an intelligence agency to be able to listen in on me should I need to. Really, back then, I would have believed that because I thought that fundamentally the incentives were okay. And I think that one of the things that happened with Snowden is that he revealed a lot that just showed how when you have got that kind of power centrally. That power that exists in government, those incentives aren't always okay, and that what the governments are getting up to doesn't necessarily reflect the will of the people, or even if it does, that isn't necessarily morally justifiable. So I think as that was coming out, it was making me probably back then looking at more kind of open source type software that I felt could be more trusted. And I was beginning again to look into encryption. And I do remember around that time diving into reading about public key encryption. So I think I was even using PGP before I even discovered Bitcoin, and find that quite difficult to use and complex. So I think all of that was kind of occurring around the same time, and that kind of sucked me into a bit of a rabbit hole at that point. And really kind of from there, that's what brought me in. And I think once you start using something like Bitcoin, you then find that associated comes with that an enhanced kind of need to look after your own security and own privacy, just because just at that point you're obviously managing money that is a bearer instrument, and you haven't got recourse to a bank, so you really have got to take your security seriously at that point. So I think that really that's kind of when it happened. It's nothing to do with the job or anything like that that brought that in.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest revelations for me out of that Snowden stuff, I mean, I think I had somewhat known, and there have been little leaks here and there about what surveillance was going on, but like you mentioned that you just kind of thought like, okay, it's worth it. I understand the need for it. Like they're making arrests, they're catching people before things happen, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that jumped out was that that type of Dragnet surveillance didn't actually lead to arrests in any large numbers, and in many cases to no arrests. Oftentimes that Dragnet surveillance didn't actually prevent any crimes, it didn't prevent any of the kind of the large attacks. And so it was interesting to see that that Dragnet surveillance was being done, and the reasoning was, hey, we're actually making you safer. But then it wasn't actually even providing that, and it was being used to actually spy on U.S. citizens, even though it technically wasn't supposed to. And there was a lot that came out of that. I mean, I feel like that was probably one of the turning points, definitely for me, and also for a lot of other people, to realize maybe this Dragnet surveillance doesn't make sense.
I think that was a huge thing as well for me. I mean, I wasn't completely unfamiliar with even the kind of the idea of whistleblowing on this type of stuff anyway. I actually studied history at university. I actually done a lot of work on researching counterinsurgency. Big kind of area of interest for me was stuff like the Vietnam War. So I was kind of, a lot of my kind of original studies have been, looking through things like the Pentagon Papers, and actually, of course, how broken some of, how the government was operating during the Vietnam War, and how certain things were being hidden from the American people at that time to do with the success of the war. I think even back then, you've seen the kind of the dangers of some of the central planning going on, and people making decisions based on statistics that were very kind of removed from people on the ground. So one of the things I do remember, I'm of that generation where 9/11 still had a pretty big impact. I went to university in 2001, and fully expecting when I joined the army in 2005 to be going to Afghanistan for reasons that completely tied to everything I'd seen happen at a kind of very impressionable age at 18, 19. But I had also read the 9/11 Investigation Commission, and a big thing comes up there with actually just how overwhelmed, for example, US agencies were, the absolute glut of information they had because of the Dragnet surveillance. And it was pretty clear kind of what a lazy way of getting intelligence the Dragnet stuff was. And it actually hindered their efforts to actually to kind of, to withstand attacks and things like that, because they just simply had too much information. And I think as you get older and you also get a bit more jaded, but I'm sure we've all been through like the TSA type checks in airports, and we're seeing this now, of course. I don't want to go into too much detail on this, but we've seen this, of course, with probably what you'll have seen with some of the kind of the enforcement of COVID restrictions. But you're starting to see kind of a lot more of these kind of arbitrary rules put in place, regardless of what you think about the threat of international terrorism, regardless of what you think about the threat of a pandemic. It's quite obvious that some of these things that kind of infringe upon your rights and actually just interrupt your day-to-day often fall into kind of quite a heavy amount of inconvenience and have second order effects that you see that may not be the original intention of the people that have put in the legislation in the first place, but happen anyway. And I think that's become kind of a lot clearer over the last few years to me, and it's been a big reason why I've kind of sought greater privacy on my online life and championed it and supported and used that kind of software.
Yeah, definitely agree. And I'm curious, is there any kind of common myth that you've seen people believe about personal privacy? Something that you've run into?
I think there's, I think the biggest kind of myth is that I think this is quite a common one though. I think it's the fact that people think that you actually can't stop yourself being listened in on by the government. The people, people have been used to hearing of all the successes of the government agency types and screw ups by criminals and whistleblowers, for example. Where they have been caught. We are all aware of spies, for example, that are obviously very kind of best in their trade potentially, and that still get caught. And this is all out of reach for the ordinary person to do. And I think that leads to a bit of defeatism in a lot of people. They've already made that kind of Faustian bargain that if they're going to have an electronic device, that's it. They need to give up everything anyway, because the large corporations, the government's going to be able to listen into everything you have. So I think that's kind of a big myth. And the reason I think it's a big myth is just because your privacy and your security are all on a scale. Encryption, as Snowden said, works. If you use something like a GPG to compose a message to someone else, I think you can be very, very sure that no one's going to know the contents of that message. I think if you've obviously got someone targeting you and they've invested time and money, other resources into specifically listening in on you, or sure, that's going to be far less likely that you're going to be able to stop yourself being listened in on. But the forces out there, criminal, government, whatever they are, they're not omnipresent. They're not everywhere. And just a few small steps often are all it needs to do for you to dramatically increase your security and your privacy. And that's well within the reach of ordinary people. So it doesn't need to be using any technology that's particularly different, that puts you well outside the space of other people. You don't need to be a hermit. You can use fairly ordinary tech. It's just about understanding a threat model, although I don't particularly like using that term when I speak to just ordinary folk. But it really is about that. What are you concerned about? What things to you are important from a privacy perspective that you don't want people to know about? And if you think of it from those kind of first principles, it becomes very easy to think about what you need to do to protect against. And also, I think to think about when you interact with services and people is not to, just because it's a nice website that may be presented well, not to abstract that away from the fact that it is being operated by fallible people, and that when you do sign up to a service, that means that your data is sitting on someone else's computer and that someone else is using it. Just to appreciate that when you go and interact with other people and other services. So I think that's really the biggest myth is that people feel that they need to give up before they can get started, and that there's no point really even doing some of this. And that really becomes very obvious is wrong. Is like when you start looking into some of the mitigations that you can do.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point about the idea of a threat model. Like you said, that phrase can be kind of daunting or scary or not helpful for normal people. But I think even just bringing it down into two kind of simple camps. One being you want to avoid Dragnet, government and corporate surveillance, and you want to avoid data breaches causing you to have personal information leaked. And I think that's the one that most people will fall into. And that's where the kind of low-hanging fruit, the not super advanced techniques are the things that are going to protect you from that. Things like using encrypted messengers, using a VPN, using maybe Tor browser, stuff like that is going to protect you from those general surveillance techniques. And like you said, if your threat model is that you're worried that a government or nation state is going to be targeting you specifically for surveillance, that is a whole nother ball game. But almost no one needs to worry about that. Most people fall into that first camp of, hey, I just want to make sure my government's not watching everything I do. I want to make sure that corporations aren't seeing everything I do and correlating that between corporations. And then I want to make sure that the companies that I give my data to, when they're breached, because almost always they're going to get breached at some point, my personal information isn't going to leak, or at least as little as possible is going to leak.
Absolutely. And I think one of those kind of analogies that gets used often is imagine just locking your door, for example, and the door in your house being locked compared to your neighbours, and therefore anyone that is looking to steal from you or grab your information or whatever it is, or target, they'll possibly leave you alone because there's an easier target next door. And I think although that's helpful to explain the reasons why you might use a better messenger or use a proper password and a password manager and all those things that get spoken about. I think the largest problem people have is that they're not aware of how the internet works, and I think that's a tough one to get across. And I think one of the things that, of course, with these tools is that they're not just offering a single function. So, for example, a key in a door is pretty easy for most people to understand. You have to put time and noise if you're going to go get round that key in a door, potentially some physical force as well. So people are very clear that a key locks a door and it stops getting someone inside. And with something like, say, your Tor browser, there's a lot going on there. Something like a Tor browser will obviously be obfuscating your origination, your IP, for example, from a website that you go to because it's going through the Tor network. It's also going to have some security features. It may not run JavaScript on the browser. It would also have potentially other privacy aspects, which aside from kind of your network privacy of the IP, but it may not make it so likely that there'd be a bookmark, an extension or something like that on the browser that could be giving away information to a service that you access. So these tools are complex for people, and therefore, if they do see something like or use something like a Tor browser, they may know that it's providing some security, a degree of privacy or whatever, but they might not know exactly how that relates to what they're doing on the internet, because it isn't clear for a lot of people that there's transport layer security going between your device and the server that you're going to. It isn't clear necessarily how a domain name that you enter is resolved to an IP address, and that takes you to that gets you to the server to get information from. It isn't clear to people that when you are downloading information from another site, that maybe an internet service provider that you signed all that information over to when you actually bought that service as a customer in your own country to your house, that they're actually able to spy, and to what degree on the sites you're going to. So I think that's the big thing as well. It's just the sheer complexity, the multi levels of just an ordinary activity on the internet these days, just how much it involves. So I think that's intimidating for people. I think certainly out even for my generation, I suspect you're younger, quite a bit younger than me. But when I grew up with the internet, I didn't grow up really knowing that much in the early days. It was a relatively mature ecosystem, so I wasn't aware of all those kind of layers to it, and that's required me to research and dig into it. And of course, most people won't do that. I think that makes it harder for them to work out how do they handle their threat model and what's going on and what they need to think about when they're looking at all this vast array of products and services that are there available for them to protect themselves or give themselves enhanced privacy when they're on the internet.
Yeah, that's something we talked about a bit in the first episode of Opt Out with Henry. Is he mentioned this idea that we need to make these FOSS tools and these privacy preserving tools so good that people just use them because they're the better tool, not because they understand every aspect of their threat model and understand how IP addresses work and how networks work and how the protocol layer stack works and all of this stuff that honestly most people aren't ever going to look at, much less understand.
Exactly.
Being able to build those tools in a way that they can approach them and use them even without understanding the details and still be gaining an impactful amount of privacy from using those.
Yeah, and I think that's actually it's more doable than some of us may think. Just as another example, I mean, we've spoken about obviously nation state attacks, Dragnet surveillance, and for a lot of people, right, that even when you go through the Snowden type revelations, they're still not bothered. And I think I think where where people are waking up a bit more to the idea of privacy is, I think, the early experience for a lot of people with Facebook is a pretty significant one. And I think one reason I kind of suggest say that is that certainly kind of people of my generation, Facebook was something that just kind of essentially launched around time of university or within a few years afterwards. So we didn't all think about the effects of sharing all your information and putting it out there. But I think for a lot of people, we've experienced the downsides of sharing that kind of information on services such as Facebook. And I don't even mean particularly information shared with Facebook themselves, but if you spend several years uploading holiday photos and all that, you do experience certain types of people snooping through your data in a way that you don't want. People are also aware that if they, for example, remarry or get another girlfriend or boyfriend, that they have got quite a large digital footprint of the ex or something like that on social media, and that in itself becomes a liability. It becomes something else to track. And I think what we have seen over the last few years is people do wake up to the idea of online privacy, not so much in a way of stopping government or corporations going into it, but actually thinking about, well, how can I protect my privacy against from my peers, and not just as in protect my privacy and stop my information being listened to, but how do I manage it in a way that I actually have a bit more control over it? Just because from a personal perspective, I would feel the impacts of that much more. It becomes hard for me to manage my life because what could have just been hearsay and rumor is now here, logged, electronically stored, and available for anyone to kind of trawl through as they wish. So I think with kind of that point from Henry's made is that products and services that compete on a way of sensibly allowing people to manage their privacy do have a good chance of being successful, just because they are actually offering a valuable service there, can give a better user experience, just because they are respecting of that thing, and it's natural to care about closing the bathroom door, closing curtains to your bedroom. We do have things that we don't need to or want to share with everyone, so privacy does need to be built into your services.
And hopefully the kind of increased flood I feel like is happening right now of a focus on privacy, even among large corporations, but also just people like Tech Lore, people like Katan from last week, myself putting out this podcast, just all of the educational content that's being put out. I'm really hopeful that a lot of this is getting and filtering down to people who haven't thought deeply about it, and they just kind of get a wake-up call to say, like, hey, maybe I should care about this, and maybe I should start taking care of some low-hanging fruit that I can knock out to achieve some better level of privacy. And
Absolutely.
just a quick question of left field, but just kind of curious. What's something you feel like almost no one agrees with you on?
I think on that one, I think the closest one to that is that I believe there's a general kind of rule out there that people can't manage their own keys, and I know that sounds potentially a bit random, but a lot of services are built here. The idea that managing passwords, that someone always does need a way to reset an account, and that people can't necessarily store a password correctly, and that can't kind of look after that technical kind of level of expertise is beyond the reach of most ordinary people. I.e., you need to be someone that does care, and you need to be someone that is technically proficient to store them appropriately and manage that. And also that we necessarily need it to be mainstream, that services are out there to provide a lot of that security for you. And the reason I say that is just that we can look on a daily basis and see some proper real stupidity from humanity. I do understand that and know that, but at the same time, it is amazing what even what the absolute less than average of intelligent person can achieve. And I think kind of a really good example of that is look at how many people go out and get a driving license. We operate something as complex as a vehicle for most people on a day-to-day basis, and do that. And everyone has to pass, pretty much in the world has to pass some form of test. They have to manage kind of quite dangerous piece of equipment if it's used incorrectly. So I think that it's just essentially it just needs people to care, and it needs to be kind of part of a culture. But if you turn that aspect on its head, that people can manage their own information, and of course that ties to something like cryptocurrency as well. The consequences that are kind of far more far-reaching. The idea of a custodian for your data or for your money suddenly becomes a lot less of a prominent piece of people's lives than it does now. And I believe that is something that, if the right tools are available, if the right things happen globally, kind of culturally and all that, then that kind of switch can happen. Because sure, we are very used to the idea of people not taking personal responsibility for things, especially in the welfare type states that we live in. But people can take responsibility if they're allowed to, and if there isn't something unnaturally manipulating the incentive otherwise. It's a very core part of an individual to be able to hoard something for themselves. Squirrel will bury its nuts. It's not an advanced thing to be able to plan for the future, to take some personal responsibility, and to do those kind of things. And I think that we do baby people and baby our users substantially in our expectations, and actually all it is a mindset change.
Yeah, and corporations have been more than happy to fill that role. I think that's something that, as we've moved further and further into the digital age, they've loved the chance to be able to be full custodians of everything. I mean, everything: passwords,
Really.
photos, every status update, every location, everything that you do, you're trusting with them. And there are definitely benefits. I mean, the biggest one is you don't have to worry about losing it because some central party is hanging on to it for you, assuming they still decide that you're worthy of an account or worthy of having that data. Obviously, you could get kicked out at any time, but there is that big upside. But I think once you realize what you can do on your own, like you mentioned, it seems complex at first. When you actually dig into it, it's really not that crazy. And there are people putting out good content. There are lots of great tools, and it's something that once you kind of fall down that rabbit hole, it leads you to so many other things, because it can start out with something as simple as switching to a password manager instead of like switching to something like KeePass, instead of leaving all your passwords in your browser sync, something like that.
Absolutely. I think you kind of also, you just come onto an interesting point here as well, in which you talk about the kind of the whole deplatforming. And I think that's the other thing that is becoming a big aspect to all this focus on security and privacy is that often, when you first look at this, it is the default, right, that you sign up to certain services, and then you look at a way, we are social beings, you look at a way to interact with others that preserves your privacy, preserves community security when you're doing so. What we are seeing a lot more, I think, now is because these are such huge tools in our lives, whether it's video conferencing, whether it's sharing media and all that, the idea of being kicked off a platform is that much more likely these days. And I know kind of Keaton would have covered this on a big part in the episode as well. And it's something kind of me and him speak about kind of quite a lot. But I think getting a level of expertise and in your privacy and in the security does help you, of course, if you are going to start hosting some of this yourself, and properly tailored privacy and security practices actually helps you with your censorship resistance and your ability to withstand being deplatformed, because it stops you oversharing information, for example, that you may not be willing to, or you may not realize you wanted to. And it puts companies, of course, at less liability if they're not got necessarily information that incriminates you or causes you problems. So these were all kind of heavily related, and I think that's another part. Obviously, we'll get into when we speak more about kind of the phones. Is that it's not just about security and privacy; it's also about reducing that need to have an account with someone. And I think that's that is certainly in the last year something I've kind of noticed is much more a driving requirement for customers as well.
Yes, let's get into that a little bit more. What are some of the tools you use regularly to opt out that you'd recommend others to take a look at, and why?
Sure. So I think kind of I think kind of the basic ones would be like encrypted messengers. I think thankfully like it's kind of far more of a default thing now. WhatsApp adding end-to-end encryption there is kind of far more normalized that. So I think Telegram, even if it was end-to-end encryption initially, for all chats, certainly kind of pioneered for instant messenger. Used for that encryption for people. So yeah, I mean, those kind of chats. I'm a big user of Threema. I've kind of, obviously you've got to kind of handle the network effect substantially here. So it's not always easy to do, but really anything that kind of gives me a default level of privacy in terms of encrypting my data from the provider. Do use emails such as Proton Mail, and I've actually been for a while now hosting my own Nextcloud instance, which doesn't necessarily encrypt everything, or it's a bit more experimental, that support there, but at least stops me putting my data, I suppose, in a very structured way for a company like Google or Microsoft, for example, to do structured analysis on and pick up data. And I tend to put on data that is encrypted onto something like Nextcloud, so something that I can self-host. I have under control of my own domain name, and it's something, of course, that's backed up. So if I lose devices or whatever, it enables me to use tools without being at the invitation of someone else. And obviously, in terms of on the cryptocurrency side, things I speak about a lot, but I use Bitcoin and Monero wallets, and they enable me to do transactions, of course, that don't require permission. So it's kind of a huge part of my life now, and it does give you a huge amount of power and benefit, right? That your savings and your ability to transact aren't always at the whims of third-party control. Be a big user of ad blockers on my internet browsers, and I have to say I really don't get bombarded with many adverts or anything, and for me that's a big part of opting out as well. Is that I think a lot of the information that people are consuming at the moment is it's a result of a lot of nudges from corporates, from governments, etc., and that it affects your ability to kind of research and arrive at those conclusions yourself independently. So for me, that's a big part there. And from social media, don't do a huge amount, but I started using Matrix a little more, federated messenger there. And the associations I have been willing to do things like hosting things like a Matrix server or something like that. So you can go out and socialize with someone on that without the same kind of fear of that room being breaking a policy of some sort for whatever was being discussed and then being shut down. So I think that's kind of a very powerful connection to kind of make there.
Awesome. I'm surprised you didn't mention Calyx OS or any kind of mobile OS there, but
So,
I definitely want to get your thoughts around
we'll
that.
get there. So the funny thing is, right, is that I think the mobile OS aspect is an interesting one because it sits so much behind all of this, like still the applications of what you tend to see on a day-to-day basis. And I think the other thing as well is that even the browsers I use now are kind of are different to what I would have used before. I mean, I'm using Pop OS more on a day-to-day basis now, and that's kind of got the benefit of an actual separately run store. So of course you can still go to a website or a repository and install the software you want, but it does also make things like ungoogled Chromium super easy to run and install. I think that's kind of a huge thing. And in an ideal way, your operating system and your browser, of course, there's a bit of crossover on those two anyway. In an ideal way for me, you shouldn't even really notice them that much. They shouldn't kind of be at the forefront because they should just be essentially a window for you to run applications on. So, I mean, it's actually never at the forefront of my mind, something like Calyx or Pop, because I just don't tend to see it too much. And I think one of the things I realize is if I ever do use another OS, such as a Windows or even Mac, and unfortunately even iOS more so these days, is that the OS does get increasingly in your face when you're using it. There are things that pop up and force you into stuff that you may not want to do, and you find yourself being increasingly restricted by. So yeah, it's never first on my mind, funnily enough.
Around that topic of, you're talking about iOS and Mac OS there, how would you say something like Calyx OS compares to iOS for privacy and security? I know iOS is kind of generally touted as being private and secure, and there's very conflicting kind of stances on it, but generally it's kind of widely viewed as an okay option. So I'm curious if you have any thoughts around kind of iOS versus Calyx OS or other FOSS Android versions.
Yeah, so this is actually kind of a really kind of huge piece, and I think it intimidates a lot of people. But I think this is probably the most useful thing we will probably end up discussing here today, because it's a subject that for a lot of people is most difficult to get hold of. I think for a few reasons. Is that just by its nature, a phone tends to be a more expensive piece of equipment, so people don't always have the luxury of trying out a whole number of different phones and operating systems. They're very personal devices once you are set up and running. There's you're kind of kept to it, right? So I kind of forget the best kind of term to use there, but there's a friction to migrating between devices unless you're particularly ruthless with your own information and your ability to move between the two. So I think for a lot of people, there's an inhibition from just experimenting with another OS, especially on mobile, where you are baked into a bit of an ecosystem. And so I think one of the things that's happened in the last few years is that I've really forced myself to use multiple OSs. And actually, I think like you, for years before getting started with Calyx and Copperhead and all that, I was a big iOS user. And the reason I was because one, I respected the security and privacy guarantees, and I think they were always pretty good. But also, I liked a seamless experience. I promise you, although some people always doubt this, it was nothing to do with the prestige or the the wish to kind of be seen with a fancy Apple device or anything like that.
You don't have Apple stickers all over the back of your car or anything?
No,
like
I never had that. I found the conferences pretty cringe. I never really liked the culture around it. I just like stuff reliable and to work. So that was a big reason for me using for being involved in their ecosystem. And I mean, they have a reputation for expensive products, but actually when you do look at it, for example, on the Android side, not the kind of what was kind of known as like an ultrabook type laptop, you're actually looking at similar prices, I think, to those products anyway. But anyway, back to your question about how the two compare. I think it's kind of there's so much to separate. So for a start, when you're comparing iOS and Android, iOS is a far tighter ecosystem. Devices are less disparate. You've obviously got one manufacturer there, Apple, largely. Obviously, they're subcontracted, obviously, amongst kind of other companies there. But Android's got far more kind of open. You've got large companies like Samsung, Motorola, those types. So you've got big difference in the actual available hardware. So it's always easy to say that something like an iOS device is more secure, especially if you're fitting it into a bite-sized article, because it's very hard to write an article and have all these exceptions. Yeah, sure, Android's great if you use the very good device, but of course, a lot of people aren't using devices, and when security incidents happen, it can often be other devices that aren't some of the necessarily the higher end that are being exploited. The other thing, of course, is because it's a far smaller range, iOS is pushing out updates and security updates, and those devices are getting them and they're upgrading that as much sooner, whereas Android is very much kept the individual original equipment manufacturers to do so. So I think there's a huge variation there. But I think kind of in from kind of our perspective is, can you get that same level of security and privacy with an Android device as you can with an iPhone or another iOS device? For me, it's becoming clearer and clearer. Really, since the probably about the Pixel 3 and the 3A, you now can, and that's been the case for kind of quite a few years. And the Nexus line of devices, then followed by the Pixels, are devices that Google's got control over, and that Android is being tightly built towards. The flagship devices, the ones that do get quick updates, so they are not the same as the other devices that you're seeing in the Android ecosystem. Also, Android itself over the last few years has had an increased focus on security and privacy. Now on something like Android 11, or I think it's actually from Android 10, you've got individual toggles and controls over what apps will have access to your location, to your microphone, all that. That power is within the software, and that all plays right into an overall assessment of how secure a private device is. And those things have to be included when you compare those. So, I mean, the other thing that happens is that you've got something like, iOS had a big thing with secure enclave and including a secure chip. I think that came out around the time of iOS 5, but don't quote me on that. And then with the Google, they built the Titan M chip, and you've now got in a flagship device such as a Pixel, unlike even the Nexus, although there was not so much a secure chip, but there were other aspects of the model there, and you've now got the kind of the benefit of your actual password being stored in a specific secure chip. You've got the ability to withstand brute forcing attacks, i.e., people getting your password or running software on a device like a kind of Celebrite device. You've got lots of mitigations now on like the kind of more modern Pixels, like you have with an iOS device, that stop at rest your device being broken into. So I think kind of on those levels, without going into too much detail, your top of the line Pixel, or actually even you're not top of the line Pixel, but your Pixel being a top of the line Android device, gives you a physical security perspective very similar security to something like an iOS device. Now, there's obviously small differences within the actual Android software, has different degrees of sandboxing, with actually the user space that the app occupies, how data is held in memory, all those things. But I think, by and large, you're looking at a broadly equivalent kind of. It can trade blow for blows, like top Android with an iOS device. But I think you've also got to factor in is what is user behavior with those devices, and even then with those devices, what kind of products and services do they sign up to? And obviously with something like Apple, the iCloud service is baked into that. And as we saw with the celebrity hacking of photos, is that when you've got a service such as Apple that encourages unencrypted information on their servers and a huge amount of metadata, that all affects your security and privacy. With something like a Google Android device, if you've got Google Play services, you've got a huge amount of data being shared there. And I think that's to kind of summarize, one of the great things about like a de-Googled Android is that you're getting very much the best of what Google offers, because they are building excellent hardware and they are building excellent software. If you're able to take out the Google service offering, which isn't particularly respective of your privacy, and pull that out and really get the best of both worlds. And I think the great thing with these custom OSs such as Calyx, such as Graphene OS, and such as even like the Copperhead OS that I have some experience with, is that this isn't taking an operating system and hacking it onto your device. The devices are fundamentally, the Pixels are designed to be able to be installed on a device like a Pixel and actually use the secure element to enforce the integrity of the software on that device. And you can even do that with a third-party signing key. So if you are one of the Calyx developers, you will actually sign software, trusted the chip will be used in that. And that's incredibly powerful, because now you've got something that gives you similar control, so something like an iPhone device, but you're not just dependent on Apple to be able to do that. And I think that's really like the big thing, and that was a big pull for me to move away from iOS, was when I realized that with the latest devices and the type of software, that combination was bringing me to something I was used to getting with iOS, but without the dependency of Apple.
Yeah, I think that's something that has become so much better with the release of Graphene OS, Copperhead OS, Calyx OS. And the concepts behind those is the trade-off used to be kind of, do you want the security and reasonable privacy of iOS, or do you want the control and flexibility of Android while sacrificing security and sometimes sacrificing privacy? There's a lot of nuance there, depending again on the vendor of the phone, since they customize the OS. But
absolutely, yeah.
you could also flash something like Lineage or like CyanogenMod way back in the day, but then you greatly sacrifice security, and there were a lot of issues around that. But with these types of OSs, you're able to not only verify that it's actually what you want to be running, but you still have that ability to be flexible in the services that you use, to be flexible in the tools that you use, to easily connect to self-hosted things and change defaults. And it gives you that flexibility, but without sacrificing the security in most situations. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance, and you did a great job of covering the majority of that nuance. But I think that's the important thing for me is you can finally opt out of the walled garden of Apple and not sacrifice, at least in a big way, the privacy or the security that comes with that. And in almost all cases, you can get even better privacy now as well. So that's why it's a really important step forward for me, and I've loved that experience so far.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing with the Lineage device as well is like the Lineage OS developers have done some really incredible work, and a lot of those apps you actually see included in stuff like Calyx OS now and Copperhead as well. Less on Graphene, just because it's a far kind of tighter and smaller app ecosystem by default that goes onto that device. But a lot of people that are experimenting with something like Lineage will actually be doing it on devices that don't give you that ability to flash the device in a way that locks the bootloader and uses the secure element on the device to enforce that. So, while some people, they actually may be fine having a relatively insecure phone physically, because maybe they just, they don't actually take the phone with them out. For some people, especially if you're, say, in a city, in a coffee shop, or you're worried about theft, you might not be worried on a day-to-day basis of your device being stolen and being exploited. But of course, if that all that needs to do is happen once, and then someone's got a device that potentially opens up to your entire digital life and more. And I think that's for me, that was always a big, that was just a big inhibitor for me to ever experiment with doing things like custom ROMs on an Android device. It had no interest, because why would I want to experiment with all that if I was going to potentially really open myself up to a lot of security problems? I think that was the kind of that's a really big thing with the Pixel devices, and with what they offer. That's incredibly empowering.
Yeah, for sure. And we've talked a bit about Graphene OS, Copperhead OS, and Calyx, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the drama that's gone on in the privacy OS ecosystem. I've just watched you go through it. Obviously, you were working with Copperhead OS in the past, and just really respected your approach. I feel like you were very slow to pass judgment and very cautious in how you handled things, and I really respected that. And I just wondered if there were some key takeaways that you had for listeners and for me, honestly, on how pro-privacy and FOSS communities can better handle these types of conflicts.
Okay, well, firstly, thank you. It's very kind of you to say that, especially as certainly when I look back on some of my communication, I do sometimes think, my God, I lost my temper there. I don't think I've always handled things the best way. But I mean, in terms of like how to handle kind of all these conflicts and all that, is that I think the biggest part here is actually empathy, and you've got to look at kind of what everyone's trying to achieve, and also I think you also got to think about, like, especially if you're involved in any kind of drama, especially online, you've got to think about what someone else is going through when you're discussing with them. I think, certainly in the last year or so, we can also think of some of the mental health issues some people may have had just because of some of the experience of the government reaction to the pandemic and all that. So you've got to take a deep breath sometimes with some of this. But when you are kind of arguing with someone online and some of this stuff, I think one of the most important things is to have to actually agree on the definitions of certain things. And that may sound like super obvious, but some people will speak about about something, and when you are having an argument, make sure you're at least starting from the point of agreeing what certain terms mean before you're discussing other stuff. And I think that always puts you into a good position to at least get the most value out of any discussion that you have. So I think that's the thing. I think the other thing as well is that you've got to try these things fundamentally yourself anyway, to really get a good idea of what this is all about. You're not going to be able to fully understand the nuances of all this by just picking stuff up from an internet argument or seeing what's on a YouTube video or what someone said. And you do need to test some of this yourself and go through it. You've got to, what people see as their threat models could be super different to what you do. Now, for someone like, I think it's very interesting, something like graphene, it is actually fundamentally a science project. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but for some people, right, they just want to see, I want the most secure phone, I want a really good phone. And it may be that something like graphene is really good for that purpose. But if you're not going to necessarily use it because the trade-offs are too much on a day-to-day basis for you to use, then maybe that's not really the best device for you. I see that a lot. People don't necessarily think that just because on paper a certain device can achieve certain things necessarily means that that's necessarily going to translate into how they're going to use it. I think if you are using a device which is really kind of engineered for maximizing security, I think you owe it to yourself as well to also, going back to what we discussed before with all the apps, you need to think about very carefully what software you run on that. And if you are the kind of person that's not going to give up opening attachments on an email, you're not going to give up running maybe software from companies like Facebook and Microsoft, then really how much is it benefiting you to use a device that massively locks down the OS and systems there for your protection if you just go ahead and do it anyway, and you bypass a lot of the protections in place. And a good example of that is something like graphene, for example, won't even come with F-Droid. I think the last time I used it. So it does actually demand a higher amount of awareness of the user that they've got to go out, and if they are going to install any more apps, they've actually got to be, at least from the get-go, go out, go onto a browser, which in itself is a risk, find an APK, like the type of download file for Android, install that, actually verify that app is valid before they start actually downloading a whole bunch of other apps. And I find that kind of quite amusing aspect to graphene, because it's pretty much impossible to use graphene privately and securely on its own as it comes. I mean, there's no encrypted messenger that comes by default onto the phone. So actually from the get-go, you've got to go out and you've got to know what you're doing with installing that. Funnily enough, with Calyx, although there is arguably, I'm not 100% sure, there's arguably less security built into the operating system in terms of hardening the memory and the access that applications have to one another. You've actually got privacy and security defaults out of the box right from the get-go. Before, when you actually have the software installed, you've already got the F-Droid repo on the phone. You even got the Aurora the Aurora store, which enables you to get apps from the Play Store without requiring an account. You've got a VPN already installed. You've already got actually a lot that means that you're not on your own when you're out there navigating for the first time a setup for an operating system to actually start using the device in anger and actually being able to do what you need to do. And I think that's also incredibly important, because a big part of security, privacy, and censorship resistance is what an operating system actually empowers you to do by default, and how it encourages you to, with its UX, to actually not make mistakes.
Yeah, it's a great breakdown of the comparisons there. And this is something I know you've written a blog post about it, and we've chatted quite a bit in some smaller groups indirectly. But a listener wanted to know, Techler specifically, why the transition for Mamushi from Copperhead to Calyx.
So I think the first thing is, before I answer that question, I've got to say why I even did Copperhead in the first place. And like at a very high level, a lot of the kind of the interest and fascination with alternative ROMs on Android came from my reluctance to have anything to do with Google on my device. It was honestly a no-go for me. And it was a huge frustration that certainly in the kind of the cryptocurrency space, the better apps, something like kind of Samurai came out there, and for Monero, there was a Monero wallet on Android long before iOS. So I actually feel it made my whole use of cryptocurrency more. I was behind because I was on a more restrictive operating system, but it was I wanted to use Android because I just disliked Google so much. So when there was the opportunity to use an alternative OS, I did use. It was being discussed, and graphene was the popular one to be used because it was the only one that was really available and known as a secure and private one. And it was really another Samurai user that had actually highlighted me to it. And amongst ourselves, we had kind of used it in the first place. And kind of long story short, we tried to reach out to Daniel McKay and the Graphene Project to try and give him some support and donations. And I won't pretend this was entirely altruistic on my part. I was also hoping that if you actually, like you do in the Bitcoin space and the aerospace, is that if you actually develop a relationship with the people that are building these tools, you actually can have a part to play as well as a user raising issues. There's often a two-way dialogue that comes through. Certainly, I feel that when I've used Bitcoin software, and I've used a huge amount from mobile software to desktop software, I've been able to raise bugs, issues, feature requests, and all of those happen. And one of the great things about this space, right, is being able to actually get involved and even as a non-developer, have your wishes and your, obviously it's up to the developers themselves to build, but you have a role to play in providing some of that information. And I think that McKay's attitude towards that, obviously people can go to the blog post to see the real details, is that we were all rebuffed very extensively. It's clear, he wasn't interested in it having anything to do with us, partly because of we'd actually even entertained having discussions with his former partner, James Donaldson at Copperhead, where they'd broken up. So he was just fundamentally not someone that we could even discuss or work with or do. And there were very important things I wanted to see on Android and that I felt needed to be there. I felt that having used graphene, that there needed to be better support for applications, for example, that were dependent on Google dependencies in the Play Store that actually kind of couldn't be run. I had a huge frustration that things like backup software didn't work properly on non-Google Android, and even the Googled Android were all very dependent on losing privacy and security there. I wanted something kind of closer to iOS on being able to back up your software to another device. It's important for me from a business and a personal perspective, having that ownership of data. And there were a few other things as well that I wanted to kind of see developed in Android from a censorship resistant perspective. There's certain stealth features that had been known in Samurai Wallet, that Google policies, for example, had stopped being implemented. So the reason I actually got involved with Copperhead was because I thought that company offered a way for, if I could market for them in a way of selling devices, I could, one, get devices that were, the people that were that were reluctant to use something that was associated with Google into their hands, but also start bringing money for a company and make it more normalized, so we could actually then start getting real paid for resources to actually work on some of those products. And really, like, the kind of complete disappointment over, of course, several months of Copperhead being not really having the best software development lifecycle, actually not really releasing features that we'd asked for, but just really making zero progress. And the features that were released, it was becoming clearer to me they were actually just taken from other open source projects, made me realize is that we weren't really getting much out of that. And I certainly wasn't feeling that customers were beginning to get value for money with the extra cost that they were paying for an operating system, when there was no discernible difference to what they could actually be getting at from using free and open source software. I also hoped that I could actually influence Copperhead themselves, given that they were previously open source, into actually going and adopting a different license to what Graphene were doing, but still an open source license that they could work with from a business perspective, as I would fundamentally believe that was very possible. And the complete reluctance and head in the sand attitude from those guys kind of showed that that wasn't the case, that they weren't going to do it. I think it all came to a head in where I was able to secure, or close to securing, a corporate deal, and the way I'd been treated by Copperhead, and the dishonesty of which I've documented on the blog post, meant that for me that was the final nail in the coffin with that relationship. We hadn't been getting value for money, I felt, as a reseller, and my customers weren't, and also dealing with someone that I felt fundamentally couldn't be trusted in business, kind of really ended that. I think the other thing that made it possible to actually move from Copperhead to another operating system was also your involvement, which was one of my customers, through their own exploration, from seeing some of the drama that had been discussed, actually, adopting an operating system that hadn't had a large hadn't really had any kind of media attention to it, and realizing that, wow, this software is actually super usable. Digging into some of the security claims from the Graphene, the Copperhead projects, and realizing that actually, that sure, they do have a security focus, but actually even a regular Android Pixel has out-of-the-box security and privacy enhancements anyway, and a lot of that is available in ordinary Android open source project. So if you've got another project that's actually focused on usability, having a good UI, including software that makes notifications possible, supports more apps without actually having to surrender still to Google, but still comes out with pretty much for your ordinary user, and actually even for quite security and privacy conscious users, then you've now got like a winning product. And for me also, it was the fact that it was reliable. I've been told by Copperhead that really, it's very difficult to support as a reseller customers using Android from just an open source project, because it's not a company. It's not they're not full-time employees. But actually, what I discovered from using Calyx along with friends and former customers from Mamushi, is that what we discovered was that the software was more bug-free on Calyx OS than it was on Graphene and Copperhead. Overall, it was a smoother user experience, and also because of myself and the other guys that work with me on Mamushi, we were actually very, very capable of supporting users using that software. Any problems that they had, it was easy to actually support, because the OS was stable. The problems that people get into just from literally years of supporting power users on Android, amongst, like, say, the Samurai community, for example, had meant that we'd pretty much seen everything before in terms of issues that users could get. I didn't need Copperhead as a company to help me support that operating system, and it was well within. And I actually felt that the users got an overall better experience. So certainly the business relationship was probably the final push, but this had been an overall kind of decision I'd been probably leaning towards over several months, as I was very carefully watching what the Copperhead team were producing in software, and comparing and contrasting that with what else was available in the market.
Yeah, thanks for walking us through that. I know that was definitely a tricky time for everyone involved, but definitely thankful for how you handled it, and good to hear a little bit more detail behind it and the rationale there. And one quick question that I just thought of was, what is the person that Mamushi is targeting? So, like, who are you envisioning as customers? Who do you think would be someone who would benefit from purchasing a phone through Mamushi that's pre-flashed?
Yeah, sure. So this is actually a big this is a big kind of thing for me. When just as I split up from Copperhead, it took me a few weeks to decide exactly how I was going to pivot the store. And I did think very carefully about whether Mamushi was even still required, to be honest. And a couple of reasons for that is that the Calyx OS devs have actually done a really good flashing tool. And one thing I'll say for the Graphene project as well is that they have a web installer. So compared to a few years ago, where you used to have to use the terminal and command line on terminal and be a bit more familiar with flashing phones and the difficulty there, is that really, if you do want to flash an operating system, including Calyx, to your Pixel, it really is within the reach of a lot of people now. So I did actually wonder kind of, how much point is there to do this, and who are we targeting? Because if the OS is that much easier to support, like, do we really need to do that? And I think a few things I've kind of I realized when I kind of spoke to a lot of people about it is that there's still actually, believe it or not, even though the flashing exercise is still a lot better, it's still actually out of reach for a few people. And in what way? Like, it's not technically really difficult to flash a phone, but it does take a bit of time. It's not something you're going to do on a day-to-day basis. So, getting that familiar with on the first time does take a bit of time. A lot of people just don't really have time or the interest to do so. It may take someone maybe even an hour to do. For me, it will probably take 15 minutes. It's a very quick process, but for someone, for say, following instructions, checking the phone, getting familiar with how to use buttons, there's just a few things to do. The other thing as well is there's actually quite a number of pitfalls with flashing a phone, and this is certainly not to scare people from doing it, but if you do something like, say, flashing the wrong image to your phone, you really can brick your device and make it completely irrecoverable. So if, for example, you're one of those kind of slightly sloppy people that don't check whether it's a 4A in brackets 5G image or a 4A image, and then you run that against your phone, you will actually render your device completely inoperable. If you, for example, during a flashing process, unplug your USB, or there's an accident there, or you're using a poor USB, you can also end up with problems in flashing. There can be driver issues. So if your main, say, operating system is Windows, you've got to fight the antivirus software a bit to sometimes kind of get through that. So, long story short, there's actually quite a few technical hurdles for even the average person that we get past and enable by doing, but with Mamushi doing that, and who we target as a customer. And the other thing, of course, is that we're actually helping people acquire an actual device, and that's actually pretty important. If you're, say, in the US, the UK, or and a lot of countries in Europe, that may be pretty straightforward. But if, for example, you don't really want a device IMEI associated to your name, and we also know that, like, in a lot of places where you buy Google Pixel phones, especially if you buy it from the Google store, you need a Google account, and they're tying that IMEI to your name and your number, and you actually may want to use Mamushi to abstract your own personal purchase from your name, because you can use something like Bitcoin or Monero to purchase a device. And also, we've started getting customers saying in South Africa, where South Africa is not actually a market for Pixel devices, but Mamushi can grab one of the devices we've got in the various places our guys are, and actually take a device, flash it, and send it out to you there. And then you're actually going to get really good value for money for your device. In fact, I actually kind of saw that we're selling Pixels cheaper on Mamushi with Calyx than you can actually get in some cases somewhere like South Africa, with just Google on your Pixel. Because of all the import duties and all that. So there's a big benefit there from what we do. The other thing as well is that the kind of people we're targeting, aside from people that are maybe a little less technically proficient or just haven't got the time, are people that actually want a bit of help once they get going. This has actually been less required with Calyx, because Calyx is a better starter for an OS than Copperhead. You've got a better installation tool. You've got more out-of-the-box applications you can get started with. But at the same time, it's not unusual for me to have like customers who after the phone say, look, I'm a bit stuck with which software, which would you recommend? And they know that they've got an actual right to kind of get in touch with me and have me walk through with them a software to get set up with. And none of that's really much skin off my nose, because it's what I've been doing kind of as really just from a voluntary thing with helping people anyway. So it's been a nice way to kind of combine all that. I think lastly with Mamushi, and this is less about what we're doing now, but more about how things are going forward, is that really the future for Mamushi is to look at hosting a form of Android open source project ourselves. And that's not to say that we're going to turn into full-time Android developers or anything like that, but I think one of the things that we've noticed, and one of the things I kind of saw actually from my experience with Copperhead as well, is that it's not, again, just about using secure and private software. Companies may, or certain individuals or groups of individuals may want software that they feel that they have better control over. And if they can, say, go into a contract with a company such as ourselves, where they've actually got an agreed amount of support, they can actually, and maybe even being tested, they've actually got a legal counterparty to have a relationship with, as opposed to, say, someone running on a not-for-profit or an open source project that they can actually have for support. And given that the people that are at Mamushi now, we're all pretty capable of doing that, and we've experimented with hosting Android open source projects ourselves. One of the things that we probably look for in the future is actually helping, say, another company install their own flavor, either of just core Android open source project without any of the extra stuff that Calyx do, something like that, and actually having being able to manage their own keys and doing that software, because for them maybe they don't want another set of developers, even an open source ones, controlling the keys to their software. And what I mean by that is that just because software is open source doesn't mean you're necessarily going to get always the software that you want to see on the phone. Now, I can't remember off the top of my head, but I think it was a few years ago, there was an April Fool's joke, funnily enough, that happened. I think, I've got to be careful now, just in case I'm wrong, so a big disclaimer here. I think it may have even been Lineage OS years ago. They ran some kind of, I think it was them, I think someone, it was like they ran an April Fool's joke, which I can't remember if it made the phone, like, as a joke, look like it was bricked or something like that. But whatever it was super bad taste. I can't remember what it was. And it freaked out a lot of people. And if you're a company and you've actually got business critical software, you can't necessarily have like open source apps. And this isn't to say, obviously, that Calyx guys do that. They seem to be super professional in how they do. But it could be something like an April Fool's joke. It could be maybe imagery or certain default apps that, as if you're politically a certain way inclined, that may just not be appropriate for your people or the organization you want in. You may want like another company to do that. And I think that's probably where Mamushi's future lies, is actually running Android open source, taking forks of projects, helping companies, or providing that service ourselves to host that, and enabling people to have a bit more ownership, where they'll still have, obviously, a full view of the code they need to. Will still provide like software, but they don't have to actually rely on an open source project for the hosting of that software.
Thanks for that picture into kind of the future. I wasn't aware of that, so it's good to hear what some of the future plans are. And one of the things you mentioned was that Mamushi accepts Bitcoin and Monero for payments. And honestly, that's one of the things that drew me to actually purchase a phone through Mamushi. I don't know, it was a while ago now, 6 months ago, was that I was able to pay in Monero, and that throughout the checkout process and the process of actually getting the phone, y'all had very good privacy preserving practices, and just made it clear that you handled data well, that you cared about the customer's privacy. And I love to see that. But focusing specifically on the cryptocurrency part of that, where do you see cryptocurrency fitting in with the other tools that you've mentioned? And then maybe what are some recommendations that you have around using cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and Monero?
Sure. So I think the cryptocurrency tools fit in a way that, like, is that if you are going through, say, the whole self-hosting thing, I would actually say, as an individual, I'd really encourage people to actually do what I've done and set up a store and actually look to accept Bitcoin and Monero. I really would recommend it. It's what I did. I'm not a web developer. I'm not even a developer of any sort, and it can be a pain at times in terms of configuration, but you can be, without any kind of coding skill, you can set up a WordPress site. And actually, I had some super helpful pointers from people on Twitter when I was about to lose my temper with the struggles of some of the early kind of WordPress themes that I'd use. I got kind of helpful pointers with what themes to install to kind of make the site easier to kind of manage and all that. And there's some great like open source plugins that go with the WooCommerce, which is the billing and the kind of the shopping cart aspect to a WordPress site, and that can all get baked in. This thing is I genuinely recommend, like, as a kind of online community, especially kind of in what I would call our community, Seth, like you're far more kind of closer to the Monero community, and I'm kind of close to the Bitcoin one. Is that I really think we should become like a nation of shopkeepers, in a way, kind of probably back 50 years ago, like a small town in England or something. And it's something that I think we should all look to do. We should be proud of, and in an ideal way, like everyone would do. And I'm sure everyone's got something that they can kind of sell and do. And certainly in the early days of cryptocurrency, it used to be a big thing, being able to go to online stores and all that. But like, even if you're selling stickers, if you're selling hardware, or even groceries or anything like that, you can do it as a little side gig. You've got to just be the first ones to do that. And there's nothing wrong. You don't have to even set up like an international site or try and be as ambitious as I have with trying to sell phones all over the world and all the problems that come to that. But even if you offer like an ability to sell something for cryptocurrency Monero, you're kind of playing that part in building a circular economy. So I think that's a really huge part. It's a big part about opting out, and it doesn't need to be, especially if you do it in your part-time. You don't need to actually live off that job. It can be your way of earning cryptocurrency, and you're actually reducing some of the analytics that go against you. I mean, for a long time we were purchasing phones with Bitcoin. I was very kind of keen to continue that. At the moment, slightly separate discussion, I'm actually struggling to actually acquire phones in Bitcoin, and I'm having to use fiat payment rails at the moment. But that's certainly no point to me, because all those purchases I'm doing are under a legal entity of Mamushi. It's a corporate business account that does that, and all those phones and IMEIs are associated with my name or my company, and then the people that are getting them are still getting those using the cryptocurrency to help preserve their privacy, and to and preserve the privacy from me, and to and obviously to kind of protect it from kind of corporate and government surveillance as well. I think in terms of recommendations, I say obviously plenty, but I think I use obviously Samurai for my Bitcoin wallet, but I've also been I have used Cake Wallet, but I'm using Monero Joe an awful lot as well now. I find syncing a little faster at the moment, I kind of like the cleanliness of that wallet in terms of not having other coins. I certainly know why Vic Sharma, the guy behind Cake Wallet, has incorporated other phones. But for me personally, I'm not looking to use debit cards or credit cards to acquire cryptocurrency. So I kind of like a wallet that just has crypto in it, because I don't really need fiat purchasing methods in there. And those work great on like a kind of Calyx OS or a standard Android open source project type device. There's no kind of dependencies on Google Play Store, and there's other ways to install the software through F-Droid, so it makes it really easy to not be baked into the kind of the larger Google ecosystem when you use those apps. And I think it's just it's great from a personal sovereignty perspective, and that you can earn, you can spend, and you can use those tools in conjunction with a website to manage those kind of to quite well. It's one thing I say though is that I think the other thing I learned from all this is actually that there's not been as good a development in the app ecosystem for merchants in the Bitcoin space, in my opinion, as there has been in Monero. One of the great things I think I've realized is that Monero is super good for setting up as a merchant. It really makes it easy to accept currency in a way that you don't really depend on any third-party provider. So I use a WordPress plugin. I can't remember the name, but it's essentially the main Monero WooCommerce one. You can kind of include it, I suppose, in show notes afterwards. But I can have like a single view key, which gets hosted with a third-party block explorer, and that enables me to generate obviously an invoice on the site, and I give up a bit of privacy to that third-party block explorer to accept payments. But then every payment I get from Monero after I receive that, I then send to another wallet which with a kind of combination of Monero protocol benefits, the ring CT, self address is that helps obfuscate the transactional privacy loss from just kind of hosting my view key with third party, and really makes for a great trade-off where I can still validate receipts of Monero through my own node, but I can also still kind of provide a fairly seamless experience on site, and also provide like a high degree of privacy for both the customer and myself. For Bitcoin, it's a bit more challenging. I use another third-party provider, but I host what we call a public key or an XPub. But there I have to actually, I then take those UTXOs that I receive for the purchases there, and then I generally put all of those through Whirlpool and mix them. And then, because of the nature of Bitcoin mixing, and when you're doing equal input-output mixing, you end up with change outputs that are quite difficult to, you have to be careful in managing, because they can give away some of the privacy. Those then I always switch into Monero through an exchange there. So it's become kind of a big kind of learning experience for me to really put into practice, rather than just say trading cryptocurrency, is actually using it in an e-commerce environment and using that in a way that really protects customers' privacy, but also protects my privacy in terms of for the store. That it also stops me, should I interact with, say, someone else, that I don't get any accounts that I have shut down if I am to deal with, let's say, a third-party provider, and they look at, say, the history, specifically in Bitcoin, of my UTXOs, because for some of my customers, I've had payments come. I can check the blockchain. I've had payments come from some pretty significant clusters and size of coins that, if I didn't mix them first, could put me on kind of quite a high degree of surveillance, just in terms of my own personal activity, for example, that I'd be doing. Not to say there's anything inherently suspicious, but how it is with certain services you operate, that they're going to be doing flags based on your risk profile and user behavior. So it's been a really good way to put into practice some of the tools that I've used, and particularly those two mobile wallets and the associated kind of desktop use on WordPress, and putting those together has been a really good way of for me kind of actually putting all that into practice and actually getting a kind of circular economy going.
I love that focus. I think that's such a good point to bring up, that a great way to not only help drive that circular ecosystem within, or that circular economy within cryptocurrency, by setting up our own little shops, selling whatever you're good at or whatever you have access to physically, or it can be a service, it could be anything. But selling that through cryptocurrency is a great way to help that circular economy grow. And like you mentioned, it really helps you to learn the tools as well. So it's a great opportunity for you to dive in and better understand, like, how do I manage my privacy? How do I run a node? How do I integrate these things into, like you mentioned, WordPress and WooCommerce? And there's lots of other options of tools that you can use and how you can integrate. And it's a great opportunity to support the cryptocurrencies themselves by helping drive a circular economy, while also really just forcing yourself to learn. I think that's one of the things that you gain so much from, is learning how to use the tools that way. And then, like, when you're doing education, it's a similar effect. When you're writing blog posts and teaching others,
Huge.
You're really learning how the things actually work. You may think you know what you're doing, but once you actually go to try to teach someone else how something works, that's when you learn whether or not you really have a grasp of it.
That's enormous, and there's a big difference between using the tools in a way just to say save money and speculate on it, which are obviously perfectly fine use cases, but to another one where you're actually balancing obligations. Obviously, every time someone purchases a phone from me, not only I'm earning that money, but I've now got a liability, so I've got to manage FX rate risk with actually purchasing a device. So there's a kind of mark-to-market trade happening there, but also for any phone that anyone purchases out of the EU or the US, that's where I've got guys supporting me, so they get paid to do that, and they only get paid in cryptocurrency as well. Actually, Bitcoin. I think they're Bitcoin Maxi, although they have used Monero. But yeah, I'm obviously paying those, so I've got to manage that. And I think there's a couple of things I've also kind of say about this whole experience, and it's a big part of opting out, is that the two guys that I use, and Diverter being one of them in the US, and I have another guy in Europe, I don't know their legal names. this has actually been something that's been put together completely through trust, and that can only be done that's only enabled through something like Bitcoin and Monero. I can pay them without knowing their legal name because you don't need to know that. Incentives are aligned. They know that it's not worth. These are relationships that have been forged in FOSS community specifically. I effectively recruited them because they had charitable instincts in them anyway to help people out. It's pretty easy to actually work out character online in a way that's far easier than, say, doing an interview in Meet Space with someone that just, say, walks through the door. And it's been a fantastic experience. I feel kind of, I just couldn't have done this without them. And in actual fact, Diverter himself is been researching how to host, say, F-Droid repos. He's done forks of apps, and in fact, even we use a really good PGP tool called TessaCube, and it wasn't running on my Android device. He just compiled it himself using a kind of an up-to-date version of like the Android. I don't know if it's platform tools or the Android Studio, that was it. And just, that worked. And, all you needed to do was effectively compile again, but I've got an APK I can use just because that software at that time wasn't being maintained. So kind of, we've got a lot of support from these guys, and none of that would have happened could I have not actually entered into some form of commerce with them. The other thing I say that's been a bit of a learning experience from all of this is actually, is really how much the fiat world really sucks. And particularly credit cards. I've got a lot of experience in broking, in institutional investment management, even some private banking and all that. But I don't have any experience in the retail side of things. I've never worked for a credit card company or anything like that. It's really awful the way credit cards work, and there's a reason I think that merchants are consolidating, and you've got large companies like Amazon doing so well, is because if you are accepting funds from, say, using, say, something like Stripe as a payment processor or PayPal, like, it cannot be stressed enough that we can't forget some of the narratives from, say, 2014 and 2013 that were very popular in the cryptocurrency space about not having chargebacks, where someone does a transaction, you send out your merchandise, and then someone afterwards says, "Oh, I didn't receive it," and you just have to deal with fraud. It's an absolute joy to deal with cryptocurrency as a merchant, because you know that there is no recourse. And I think that we forget about that, especially in this kind of age on Twitter where everyone obsesses over sound money and the joy of saving, even while we're kind of still looking at incredibly nascent cryptocurrency that can kind of experience 50% drops or whatever, is there's a fundamental use case of Bitcoin and Monero is good e-commerce. It's the fact that I can take a payment, I can use my own node and validate and verify it, and then I know that can be trusted, and I can then go ahead and do my job, and I'm not having to pass costs on to customers for managing fraud.
Yeah, I mean, my only real exposure to kind of using cryptocurrency as a merchant, quote unquote, is accepting donations, and that's been incredibly freeing and simple compared to using the traditional financial system. But as someone who likes to pay in cryptocurrency literally whenever possible, and I'll even pay more because of how freeing it is from a privacy perspective, how simple it can be and quicker it can be, and just how much I don't know, you avoid so many of the pitfalls of using credit cards and all of the issues that go around that. And there are definitely drawbacks compared to that. You don't get your reward points or whatever, but it's incredibly freeing, and it's a whole nother side of opting out, that the more you do it, the more you just, I don't know, I've fallen in love with cryptocurrency more and more the more I actually use it to pay for things. That really hits home.
I really love paying with it. I mean, I'd say the only thing that kind of comes close to the user experience of paying with crypto is using something like, I haven't used Apple Pay because I've literally never had an Android device with Google on it, but I've used Apple Pay, and that's pretty good in terms of, you get presented with like a check. And in fact, for a while we supported Stripe payments at Mamushi, so you could use Apple Pay to pay there. And that was one of the reasons I actually went with Stripe in the first place, was to because I thought my actual expectation is that we're going to be selling to some iPhone users, especially iPhone Bitcoiners, who will be buying this phone to get an actual proper Bitcoin wallet and won't have a way of privately doing this. And actually, it was also another reason I even kind of, although I've obviously been a long-term fan of Monero, having used it for years, I also kind of, it was another big reason for me putting Monero into the store. It was because, well, if you're an iOS user and you want to move to Android, like, how are you going to pay for a Mamushi device and get privacy from me? So, you just cannot really do it easily using iOS Bitcoin wallets. So your only choice, thanks to the Cake Wallet guys, was actually to pay Monero. So it was actually a very pragmatic reason I went with Monero. Funnily enough, since then, I think it was a good thing for me to do in the store, because I think we're probably in the position now of actually having more customers that use Monero than Bitcoin. And I mean, we're not doing kind of volumes of devices that kind of merit kind of releasing stats or anything like that. But I've noticed a substantial uptick. I think certainly when we pivoted away from Copperhead, is that we're selling more devices now than we were. I think obviously being open source helps that. A lower price point helps that. But I think there's a stronger ethos in the Monero community towards open source than we've seen in the Bitcoin community, unfortunately. Big watering down the culture in Bitcoin, which has been enormously frustrating to see. And it's been really heartening to see kind of how well received the Mamushi stuff has been by kind of Monero users. And I think Monero users are also, there's a pragmatism as well in the fact that if you're using Monero, there's probably a good chance that you don't want to spend time managing UTXOs and really tinkering with your privacy. So they like the idea that they can just kind of go to a site and put in, maybe a fake name in a mailbox, flash a QR, and off you go. A few days later, you get a private phone coming in the post. So I think there's a reason that they're kind of they're responding to it more than Bitcoiners.
I love to hear that. Yeah, I think I've seen a lot of people in my circles on Twitter who are Monero users jump at the opportunity to use Mamushi, and hopefully we'll see more and more of that Monero usage actually increase in these merchant use cases.
I think so, and I think it's interesting as well is that we're at a kind of interesting juncture now where Lightning use is picking up a bit in Bitcoin, and people are managing the UX challenges with that. Although it's kind of got the benefit of some instant payments, you've got to manage channels. You can deal with kind of payment failures, but also I think more people are concerned about potentially the privacy implications of running Lightning, and obviously the security and the overhead to that. So I think it's an interesting space to see is that where you are getting merchants is the ones that are offering Lightning, seeing kind of what usage they're getting on Lightning, and especially if they're offering Monero as another option, whether people kind of opt to go one or the other. I certainly know the Silent Link site, they sell kind of eSIMs, like anonymous eSIMs. They offer Lightning, and they don't do Monero. But I also know that one of their payments that they kind of said to me was an example of Lightning usage being picked up had actually out of band. They'd used something like FixFloat or something like that, that they'd used Monero to pay for a Lightning transaction to go to that site anyway. So take that as you will.
Awesome. Well, last question I wanted to get to here was just real quick, what advice would you give to someone who's just starting to realize the need for personal privacy?
I think you've got to think about, I think don't get intimidated with trying to be anonymous. That's the first thing. There's pretty much no need to be anonymous these days for a lot of people in most kind of walks of life. Obviously, it's kind of fun to think about the idea of being anonymous and using some of these tools. I think you just you need to be mindful of what you sign up for. So, if you are going to be starting off with these tools, don't just assume that you need to use something. So, for example, if you're starting a new job, maybe you're being a real estate agent or you're starting up a new shop, there's always that temptation, right? Okay, well, I'm going to have a page on Instagram or Facebook or whatever like that, because everyone else does it and it's important to my job. Think through, do you actually need that? How much more effort is it just a couple of weekends to get a pretty basic site up there where you own your own data and you can kind of not have to sacrifice too much? Just make those choices. Think about when you're, in terms of privacy perspective, when you are signing up to a service, what are you signing away? You don't necessarily need to read all the terms and conditions and everything you sign up for. But think about the information that you're giving out there, and just what would it be like if someone was to to actually see that in person. We give out our addresses way too much these days, as we're seeing with things like the ledger hack and things like that. And a lot of people think, oh well, everyone has my address and all that. But when you start getting your addresses, say, tied up with certain purchases, that moves on to a whole other ball game. And I think you just need to pause a bit and not rush into necessarily all the new fads. Be aware of kind of companies that are specifically marketing in a way that's engineered to get engagement. I know kind of when Clubhouse, the chat room thing kind of came out, they were kind of big on making it exclusive and only going to iOS users and those type of things. Like, be aware of like the techniques that companies are using. And I think also, just in terms of just general principles, is if you've got an app that provides a function, find people that use these as a day-to-day basis, and go on, whether it's Telegram or Twitter. You'll always find plenty of people happy to dispense advice. That's one thing they're not short of on Twitter. But look for an open source alternative if you can, and look at kind of people that have got maybe similar risk profile or similar life to you when you're getting their advice. I think be aware of friendships in the place. People will shill products, not always kind of for the wrong reasons, but people like to help friends out. You see it with Mamushi as well. There's guys that I've helped in the past that then I'll see them on Twitter dropping, I'll buy a device from Mamushi, help them out. They've used it maybe, and maybe they're a happy customer, and that's great. But also be aware that they're probably a mate of mine. That's kind of why they may be doing it, and that's happening all over the space. Journalists that are shilling certain kind of software, they may be doing it because they've got a personal relationship with the developer. I think there's good reasons why. If you look at Graphene OS, the attention that project got was because of certain journalists that had maybe a relationship with Edward Snowden, and that then causes a tweet, and then suddenly everyone rallies around. So just be a bit cautious of some of the, what gets championed just because some thought leader or whatever says it. Really kind of go and use it yourself. And I think the other thing, lastly, I'd kind of caution is that open source is no panacea for everything. One of the reasons I recommend something like software like Signal and Threema is not just that they're open source, is that there's actually been audits on that software. And for me, that's really like that's the kind of the gold tier of software that you can get, is that if you can find software that not only has got like obviously active use, but if there's actually the Monero core team are great for this, is actually paying someone to kind of go in and interrogate that software and test it and really put it under the microscope. That can really reduce your risk factors hugely, because there's a lot of software out there that's open source that just really isn't getting used or is not getting contributed to anymore, that still exists as recommended on old blogs, that really just may not cut it anymore. So I think that you just got to be aware of that when you're using it.
Great. Well, thanks so much for coming on. I mean, we went probably double the length so far of episodes, but I feel like it was super easy. There's just so much to chat about. So thanks for jumping on. It's been great.
Not at all. Thank you ever so much for your time, and hope it's not too late for you.
Yeah, no, it is. It's definitely late, but it's been great. So, last thing, where's the best place for people to find or communicate with you?
I think probably like the best places where I'm kind of most around, just because the larger communities, are Twitter and Telegram. So they're kind of place. Certainly don't feel afraid if you've got specific questions. There's a contact form on the site to drop into. I would also say is that if you're an open source developer, specifically like a Java dev, and you've got something that you say wanted to see on Android or something like that kind of that you think kind of belongs in in our mission, and you're either looking kind of say for some funding, or you kind of want a platform to kind of get your software out on, definitely drop a note. Even if we can't help specifically, there's plenty of people that we are in touch with that may do. Absolutely, and don't be afraid to try these tools yourself.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Opt Out. If you did, please take a moment and subscribe to the podcast, or if you're already subscribed, share it with one friend or family member this week. As always, you can check out the links to Max's content and contact info, as well as links to all of the tools we discussed in the show notes for this episode, or at optoutpod.com. Now get out there and opt out this week. For this week's project to help you opt out, I'd recommend you take a look at Standard Notes, an encrypted by default notes app that is free and open source, but does offer subscriptions, while accepting Monero, to Standard Notes Extended. For those that choose to support Standard Notes via subscription, extensions add a lot of power features, including encrypted attachment uploads to your own web dev server, like Nextcloud, as well as many text editors. However, the base free version is still extremely powerful, has great encryption defaults, and is an excellent choice for moving off of closed source and surveilled solutions like Google Keep or Evernote. For more info, check out the links in the show notes.